This video is inspired by a chat that I had with some friends a while ago. We were talking about our experiences at school, which was basically the 12 or 13 years, depending on which country system you're in, that you spend going through pretty much mandatory education. We reflected on some of the unpleasant experiences that we've experienced ourselves or seen other people experience at school. And it was only in that process of reflection that we realized something much worse could have happened to us mentally, and that may have left a permanent scar on our lives if things happened just a little differently and directly to us. And that was when we realized how precarious, if that was the right word, how each child's experience going through school could have been. Not in the case that the child could have suffered some serious life-threatening injury, usually it's not in that sense, but in the sense that the child could have been traumatized for life in some way by some sort of very unpleasant experience. The structure of this video, I'm going to start with some anonymous anecdotes, and then I will move on to discuss this overall system, the schooling system, which is what is reflected in the title, Schools Are Dystopic. And as a disclaimer, I'm not trying to say all schools are dystopic and we shouldn't send our children to schools and schools are horrible and stuff. I'm just saying, by the mere nature of the power structure in schools, they have the potential to be like a lot of the dystopic regimes that we see in novels, and I will identify some of that traits later in the video. Anecdote number 1 about written codes. There's a girls' boarding school, and they had very strict rules on lunchtimes. So they had this dining hall where they could eat. The thing was basically that they had different time slots when girls of different seniorities were allowed to enter the dining hall to eat their lunch. So you get a 10-minute time slot where you're allowed to enter the hall, but you don't really get a limit on how long you're allowed to stay as long as you leave before the end of lunchtime. That was for girls from like year 7 to year 13. Basically the case was the more senior girls could enter first, and then the junior girls had to enter often like at the last 10 to 15 minutes of lunch, and they were made to like grab their food, which was often very leftover food, and finish their lunches within the time frame. And when my friend told us this, we all found it was just really unreasonable, but they all just put up with it because, they just accepted that was the way how it was. And they were all like really happy when they rose through the rank of seniority and then they got like more time to eat. One of the most prominent sorts of unwritten codes in school is who you sit with at lunch. So take the example of that friend who had a dining hall. Well, the dining hall had like individual tables, which are not really like the long formal tables at Cambridge halls, but like individual smaller tables. And you don't ever sit at a table alone. Like, you don't ever do that. Everyone had a morbid fear of that. And basically, they were boarding school and then they arranged girls in like houses, or just like the dorms, how the dorms are arranged. And the most normal way was that you sit with girls from your house. So you often come and leave with them, which means you don't really have control on like who you want to eat with, when you want to eat your lunch, and whatever you want to do when you eat your lunch. You just had to conform, even though it's like the school didn't tell you have to sit with them, but it's this invisible pressure, which is an unwritten code. And also, I remember when I was going through school, and I've been to like a lot of different schools, and what remained fundamentally unchanged among all those different schools I've been to is that everyone has a morbid fear of eating lunch alone. And I think this is mainly not driven by the fact that you're scared of being alone. It's like, oh my gosh, I feel so lonely because I'm sitting there alone. No, it's because you're scared of being seen alone. So, the stories of people eating lunch in toilets because they couldn't find anyone to sit with is because they don't want to be seen alone, not because they don't want to be alone. It's like you're just branded this image of like the loser figure if you're seen eating lunch alone. And I remember like, personally, I was definitely not free from the social pressure. I felt like I would rather just like walk around a lot during lunchtime as to not be seen like actually sitting alone there in the corner, which was sad. Or I would sit with people that I don't really enjoy talking with, and I'll just sit there for the sake of being seen with someone. rather than sit there alone and probably do something else that I would have preferred myself. So this section deals with people in the school who are in a position of power to abuse that power. I'm aware that abuse of power is in general a minority case and they don't happen at a lot of schools. In fact, I would say there weren't any significant cases of abuse of power at all the schools I've been to, so I was really grateful for that. But if some students do have the misfortune of encountering a teacher or staff who have negatively exerted their influence on them in the form of an abuse of power, I think that could be something that traumatizes them for life. So basically, the story of my friend, she was quite young, she was like in primary school, and she had this online blog where she wrote like, you know, those very youth fiction, fan fiction vibe stories. And it's kind of funny because it was sort of like a fan fiction based on some people in her class. And then she invited some people from her class to read it. And then because some people started reading it, it spread. And then somehow like her teacher got informed about it. And then there was one day when the teacher read out her blog like in front of the entire class and framed it as an instance of bad writing. And at the meantime, her teacher read out another girl's story that she's written for a class assignment and framed that as like the opposite example of good writing. So she basically like humiliated my friend in front of the entire class. My friend was like really confused and angry at the time, but then like I think her parents did a good job in going home and then they told her just ignore what the teacher said, just pretend it didn't happen. Like her parents didn't make a big deal out of it, as some parents would have. I don't know, they would have said something like, you shouldn't have written that and stuff, and yeah. But imagine if there's someone whose like parents didn't deal with it as well, and maybe that person in general just has a lower sense of self-esteem and are more sensitive, then it could scar someone for a significant amount of time, to be honest, that sort of behavior, that sort of abuse of power. Because like her blog was certainly not something submitted for the class, it's something that's written in her private time, and in theory the teacher shouldn't be able to have any sort of power over whatever she does in her private time unless it's like illegal or something. And there's also instances where people in positions of power don't have to do anything to abuse their power. They could turn a blind eye to things. It's like a sort of passive abuse of power. So basically I had a friend who lived in a dorm, and then they had like chores where there was like this roster and girls on the roster took turns doing the chores. So there was like basically one Asian girl in that entire dorm set, and she was bullied mainly by like 2 to 3 white girls, and it was quite obvious that it was for racist reasons that she was bullied. What the white girls did was that they told the Asian girl to do extra chores that wasn't really her fair due, and when she had to share the chores with someone else, one of them would disappear, just make her do it herself. And the entire time, the head of the dorm turned a blind eye to it, even though she was clearly aware of what was happening. And from what my friend said, it was probably because she was a kind of racist woman. So because the bullying was occurring out of racism, she sort of just turned a blind eye to it, like she didn't want to address it. That girl, like there was no way for her to get out of it. Eventually she transferred schools and my friend never heard about her ever since. Having given these anecdotes, what I want to say with these is that it's precisely the nature of the system of our schools that allows these sorts of injustices to happen and go unchecked. In the majority of the situations, there's like no way to remedy the suffering except by transferring schools. In the context of I'm saying, well, the system allows or facilitates this sort of behavior, I'm not intending to include cases of very serious bullying or abuses of power that literally are hitting illegality, because obviously the system is not going to tolerate those sorts of behavior in normal circumstances. But you know, the examples I've given are more like subtle rules or very subtle abuses of power. And they are allowed in the system either by tacit or explicit consent. And the reason why I'm calling the school system dystopic, or that it has the potential to be dystopic, is for the reasons that I shall list now. There are basically 6 points of commonalities that I found between schools and dystopic regimes. Number 1, people are told to obey rules without being given any justification. Number 2, the rule enforced has to be absolute. 3, there's no procedural or democratic way of speaking against the rules or trying to change the system, even when you perceive the rules to be unjust. 4. For the majority of the case, people are not aware of fair resistance as an option. 5. People are disempowered by a system of mutual surveillance. Some people who are clearly more in favor with the authorities than others, and these people often play a big role in helping to internalize the rules in the overall community because they benefit the most from it. And finally, 6, they're in an environment relatively insulated from the outer world. Let us consider 1 to 4 first, and I think they're the most defining traits of dystopic regimes. I think what matters the most is not necessarily that people have no means of challenging the power, it's that they're not aware that challenging the power is an option. So, at schools, especially for children at younger ages, it would never cross their minds to consider the question of whether school rules or what the teacher told them to do was just. They don't have that sort of idea. In them, it's really just obedience or disobedience, and whether they obey or not obey, it's never for the reason of, I've given this rule an evaluation I found is reasonable or is unreasonable. Of course, I agree that most schools do have pretty good teachers and they're well regulated. But if there is just one school that exploits this sort of nature in children and makes unfair rules, or if there's one teacher who abuses their power to abuse the children, it could have very drastic consequences. Because there is almost no possibility of the students resisting unfair treatment when they're not even aware that it's unfair or that resistance is an option. Let's consider 5 and 6. These are the 2 points that I think really internalize the students' obedience to the system. So if you obey the system well and you benefit from it and you're like a teacher's pet or any sort of thing, then you obviously are going to like the system. It's like the more you help to reinforce the system, the more rewards you can see yourself getting. And I think the insulated environment is particularly an issue with boarding schools because the students are unable to see a world where those explicit or implicit rules are not at play. And hence, it's so much easier for them to internalize the rules as something that's not just the rules of the school, but the rules of their life and their world. Because if you board at a school, the school is almost the entirety of your life. And when you internalize these rules, you, for example, feel very shameful for eating lunch alone. And once they've internalized the system, they tend to reinforce the system and uphold it much more because they perceive it as the only way that they could live well, in a sense. So what are the implications of this discussion? Well, I'm not saying all schools are bad, that we should ban them. I've personally been to some really good schools and I'm very grateful for the people who upheld those schools and ensure that the school was good. Because I do think that the teaching and administrating and the culture of the school can shape how the students treat each other to a large extent as well. I think one implication is the stronger that schools in a society tend to reinforce obedience, the more its citizens tend to grow up being used to obeying because they've been raised like that. And they sort of have this natural mindset built in that is obeying authority is just a sort of a default behavior unless in exceptional circumstances. This is just a mere possible implication. Of course, I know there are a lot of other more influential factors that decide the political structure of a country. I think this video is very much a ramble. There's nothing very conclusive I wanted to make with this. It was just this interesting connection that I possibly drew between dystopic regimes that I've read about and the nature of schools that we've discovered through some just chit-chat discussions. I'm pretty sure all of my viewers would have gone through a schooling experience, or some of you may be going through it right now, so I'm very curious to hear what you think about the situation and what you think about your schools.